And now from Psalm 30, verses 1 through 5. I will exalt you, O Lord, because you have lifted me up and have not let my enemies triumph over me. O Lord, my God, I cried out to you, and you restored me to health. You brought me up, O Lord, from the dead. You restored my life as I was going down to the grave. Sing to the Lord, you faithful servants. Give thanks for the remembrance of God's holiness. For God's anger lasts but the twinkling of an eye, but God's favor endures for a lifetime. Weeping may spend the night, but joy comes in the morning.
Last Sunday, I shared an image of a pond or a calm pool of water and invited us to imagine a large rock or stone tossed into the pond, sending out waves and ripples to the very end of the pool. At first, those waves, of course, are quite violent and large, but then gradually they are smaller and persistent over time, reaching out to the furthest end of the water. The idea was that the resurrection is much like that similar kind of image. It's a reminder that the resurrection continues to ripple out even to our day, and that Easter is not just a single day, but actually a season, a longer period of time. And in these 50 days after Easter, a time that is called Eastertide, we explore what these ripples do, what they look like, and how they affect the early church, the disciples, and how they continue to affect us today. Last Sunday, we read from John chapter 20, the end of chapter 20, the story of doubting Thomas and the beginning of the new church as they are sent out, as Jesus breathes the Holy Spirit within them and sends them out as God had sent him out. The ending seemed quite neat and tidy. But this morning we see that there is one more story that John has to share with us from John chapter 21. It too is a story about the ripples of the resurrection. The disciples, we find, are a little bit without focus. They're struggling to find out and to understand what are they to do now that Jesus has departed. What is their next course of action? And as we'll hear, they have returned back home. At least a bunch of them have, to Galilee, back to their familiar territory where they first met Jesus, unsure how to proceed. So I invite us to listen to God's invitation here to each of us, to the church, to our communities, as the good news of the resurrection continues to ripple out. Be reading from John chapter 21, verses 1 through 19. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, which, by the way, is another name for the Sea of Galilee. And he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. And they said, we will go with you. And they went out and they got into the boat. But that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach of the sea. But the disciples did not yet know it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, children, you have no fish, have you? And they answered him, no. He said to them, cast the net to the right side of the boat, and there you will find some. And so they cast, and now they were not able to haul in their net because there were so many fish. And the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. When Simon Peter heard this, he threw on his clothes and he jumped into the sea. But the other disciples remained in the boat, dragging in the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw there a charcoal fire with fish on it and also some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." And so Simon Peter went aboard and he hauled the net ashore, which was full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come, have breakfast with me." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" For they all knew that it was indeed the Lord. Jesus came and he took the bread and he gave it to them. And he did the same with the fish. Now, this is the third time that Jesus had appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Now, when they were finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And he said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he had said it to him a third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your belt and go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death in which Peter would glorify God. And after this, Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Some of you may know of Wendell Berry. He's a well-known poet and essayist and farmer who lives in Kentucky on land that has been in his family for generations. He makes an interesting claim about reading the Bible in one of his writings. He claims that it is an outdoor activity. This is what he writes. He says, "I don't think it's appreciated how much an outdoor book the Bible is. It is best read and understood outdoors, and the further outdoors, the better." Or that has been my experience of it. Passages that within walls seem improbable or incredible, outdoors merely seem natural. This claim came to mind as I was reading this passage from John 21 this week, because this is certainly an outdoors story, as the disciples are on the Sea of Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, fishing, and Jesus meets them there. And together they have a breakfast on the beach, cooking fish and bread over a charcoal fire. I think it invites us to explore what is going on here. And even though we are inside today, I think we're invited deeper into this story of a seeming innocent breakfast on the beach. Let me share another writing from Wendell Berry. In one of his poems, he writes this: "So, friends, every day, do something that won't compute. Love the Lord, love the world, work for nothing, take all you have and be poor. Love someone who does not deserve it. Give your approval to all you cannot understand. Ask questions that have no answers, and practice resurrection." was that simple yet profound statement of practice resurrection that I think is at the heart of our gospel story this morning, that kept coming back to me again and again in this text. How might this be a story about practicing resurrection, and how might we be invited to practice resurrection in our own time and place by this gospel story? So let's start simply with the understanding of what does it mean to practice. If you go to the dictionary, you'll find two different understandings or meanings of practice. First, practice is described as being a repeated exercise in or a performance of an activity or of a skill. We think of examples of musicians and artists and athletes who practice over and over again the basic skills of their craft. I heard a wonderful story once about Pablo Casals, who is considered probably the greatest cellist of all time. At the age of 93, near the end of his life, he was asked, why did he continue to practice the cello for 3 hours a day? And he replied this, he said, I'm beginning to notice some improvement. So those who have this skill continue to practice, to use those skills over and over again. But there's also another meaning for practice, which is a noun. And it is this, it is the application of an idea, of a belief or a method, as opposed to just thinking about or opposed to just theories about some application. It's the actual use of this belief. And we think, for examples of lawyers and doctors who we say have a practice, right? They practice law or they practice medicine. We hope it means they're not just learning how to do it, all right? It's something, an application of the ideas in real and concrete ways. And so when we think about practicing resurrection, I think in some ways both of those meanings are here in John 21. There is certainly the need for the application, the concrete living out of our faith of what the resurrection means. But there's also clearly the need for the repeated use and application of that same skill over and over again as we too seek improvement. And so how does Jesus invite us to practice resurrection? Let's look at what the story says to us this morning. The first thing that I noticed in this story is the way it is many ways a gentle and quite ordinary story. It is set back in Galilee, not in Jerusalem, which is the center of the religious and economic power of the Jews, but rather it goes back to Galilee, to the beginning of the story. And Galilee is not the center of the world. It's not the center of power or influence, but rather it was an ethnically mixed area, filled with peasants and working poor. A place you escaped from, not a place you went back to. And so it's not the place we expect the story of salvation to unfold, not where we expect God to be found. And in the story, there's no great drama, like we heard last week of the disciples gathered, frightened in the upper room of Jesus suddenly appearing in their midst, not once but twice, dramatically showing them the scars in his hands and on his side, and Thomas proclaiming his faith when he finally sees him. There's none of that drama today. Instead, we have this core group of disciples, 7 of them, who seem to be going back to what they know. They're out fishing, something they're familiar and comfortable with. And we have to wonder if they've forgotten everything that has happened in the past and are going back to their regular lives. But then, of course, as dawn approaches, as the light begins to shine, Jesus is there on the beach. And he's told that they have not caught any fish, which we can see as maybe a sign that what they're doing is not fulfilling their true purpose. And there on the beach is this man they don't yet recognize who asks them to cast their nets on the other side. And as they pull in this huge haul of fish, Peter, ever the impetuous one, jumps off the boat and swims to shore while his friends bring in the nets. And there they find Jesus doing what? He's cooking breakfast over a charcoal fire. Not a spectacular miracle, but rather they're a common everyday thing. But maybe hinting back to that wonderful story of the feeding of the 5,000 with the fish and the loaves and the bread. Jesus is there, fulfilling the need of his disciples who have been out on the sea all night, giving them bread and fish to eat. The author Nora Gallagher borrows the line from this poem, Practicing Resurrection, in a memoir that she has written. Near the end of the book, she writes this. She says, "We spend so much time in the church believing, in quotes, in the resurrection, or not believing 6 impossible things before breakfast, that maybe we lose the point. What if the resurrection is not about the appearances of Jesus alone, but also what about what those appearances point to and what they are asked? It is finally what we do with these appearances that matters, after all. We can make them into superstitions, or, she says, we can use them as stepping stones to a new life. We have to practice resurrection," she writes. And so I think it's clear in the story that practicing resurrection isn't necessarily about doing spectacular things. It doesn't have to be in a special setting that this goes on. There don't have to be choirs of angels singing. But instead, in the ordinariness of life, of a group of fishermen out working on the sea, of a common breakfast on the beach, that is where we can practice resurrection. The author E.B. White is famous for the books Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little and others. Near the end of his wife, Catherine's life, he wrote an essay talking about her love for gardening, even as she struggled with her final illness. He said each year she loved to plan and to diagram a new garden. She would order seeds and sit out in the garden for hours making plans. He says that when she became so ill she was almost incapacitated, somehow she managed to still make it outside to her garden. And when it was time to plant, this is what she did. And he writes this. She was armed with a diagram and a clipboard. Catherine would get into her shabby old raincoat, much too long for her, put on a little round wool hat, and proceed to the director's chair placed at the end of her garden plot. And she would sit there hour after hour in the wind and the weather, surrounded by dozens of packages of new bulbs, baskets of old ones, ready for the intricate interment. There was something touching about her bedraggled appearance on this awesome occasion. The small, hunched-over figure, her studied absorption into the implausible notion that there would be another spring. Oblivious to the ending of her own days, which she knew perfectly well was near at hand, sitting there with her chart under the dark skies of a dying October. And there she was calmly plotting the resurrection. It's in those everyday things of life that we can see the resurrection. But our story this morning, of course, doesn't end with breakfast. There's not that neat ending to it. Instead, we have this exchange between Simon Peter and Jesus, the threefold question and answer between the two of them. Now, the scene, I think, clearly points to chapter 18, where Peter, you may recall, around another charcoal fire, has denied Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times, saying he is not Jesus' disciple. And those denials are hanging in the air as we read this story this morning. And I think Jesus here is giving a lesson about practicing resurrection. He's not there to shame Peter. He's not there to forget, though, of what has happened because it is a reality. But rather, in a profound act of love, Jesus is bringing healing and wholeness to a relationship that has been broken. And in doing so, he gives Peter a new mission and a new purpose in life: to feed his lambs, to tend his sheep, to be a shepherd to the flock. And so in the story today, Peter is not only forgiven and restored, he's also given new life and new direction. He is to take on that role of the shepherd of the people as this newly formed church begins its new directions. What happens today in this story is what one author called a blueprint for ministry. And we notice a shift here. That previously there had been stories about fishing, about gathering, about catching, about hauling in and bringing in this gathering of fish. But now Peter is given a different job of shepherding, and that is the caring for, the feeding, the tending of, and the taking care of the flock. All for the purpose of sending back out. But instead of just gathering, there is also now the love and care for the flock of people. The biblical scholar Tom Wright says this: "Here we find the secret of all Christian ministry, yours and mine, lay and ordained. If you're going to do any solitary thing as a follower and servant of Jesus, this is what it is all built on," he says. Somewhere deep inside, there has to be a love for Jesus. And although goodness knows we've all let him down enough times, he wants to find that love. He wants to give you a chance to express it. He wants to heal the hurts and the failures of life. And in love, he wants to give us new work to go out and to do. And I think that's what practicing resurrection is all about. Responding day to day to those everyday situations in life. Answering that question, do you love me? By taking concrete action in the world. And so I think this morning we may be invited to be something like Peter, to finally recognize what Jesus is calling us to be willing to dive headfirst into those waters, those chaotic waters of baptism that bring new life, to swim with all of our might towards the shore, toward the one who loves us, the one who welcomes us with open arms, and who feeds us and gives us new life. Let me close with the quote I shared earlier from Wendell Berry. It goes like this: "So, friends, every day do something that won't compute. Love the Lord, love the world, work for nothing, take all that you have and be poor. Love someone who does not deserve it. Give your approval to all that you do not understand. Ask questions that have no answers, and practice resurrection." To God be all praise and honor and glory this day. Amen.